So welcome to this session about learn how to use Microsoft Search and integrate your business data. My name is Tony Pohl. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I found out that searching for content, or better, finding content, is an important part, especially in Microsoft 365 with so many services. And that was more or less the intention to create a session about how you can use Microsoft Search. You can reach me. Here is my email address, my Twitter account. I also have all the content that I'm showing in this session in my GitHub repository. You can find it. I'll give you a link later. And I also want to thank you, the organizers of Teams Nation, because this is a great event with so much valuable content for the community. It's for free. It's very nice, consumable. So that's a really good thing, a good opportunity to be here. And thanks to all the organizers and all the helping hands here. So with that, let's start with this session here. Why I'm started to create this session here. In 2019, McKinsey published a study where they said, well, at least 20% of work time is spent searching for information. And often we have the problem, we simply don't know where this data resides. We simply don't know, was this an email with a specific topic? Was it in a document? Or where is the information I'm looking for? And Microsoft answer for that is Microsoft 365 Search or Microsoft Search. And this is more or less the topic of my session. So I have actually two parts here. The first part is how to use and configure Microsoft Search. And the second part is how can you integrate your own business data in Microsoft Search, in the Microsoft Search experience. And that's important, for example, if you have a database, you want having your products available in Microsoft Search as well, or an HR system or any other data source where I say, I have external data, I want to connect them, I want to make them available in the Microsoft Search experience. So first of all, I have a short overview slide here. What is Microsoft Search? So the main part here is it's no longer the typical search we are used for Microsoft SharePoint. It's a personal experience, which means if I search for data, let's say in Outlook or in SharePoint, I might get a different result than another user in my organization that's searching for the same content. Why is that? Because it's all based on the Microsoft Graph, based on the signals that are sent to Microsoft, to the Microsoft Graph system, and saying, okay, this user is connected with that user because he exchanges chats or emails or something like this, and we have the opportunity here to access that data that is stored in Graph. Also, we have, of course, only access to data that we are allowed to see, which means if I'm not allowed to see content of a SharePoint site, of course, I will not see that in my search result as well. So what does Microsoft Search cover? You can see a lot of icons here on that screen here. So it covers currently mostly, of course, all of the Office services like Word, Excel documents, and so on. So everything that's stored in a file, in a SharePoint or OneDrive file. And of course, with that, also content is stored in Teams. You can use even Bing search for accessing that content, and more services are to come. And that's important for the users. Where can I find these topics, or this? Where can I search for content with Microsoft Search? And here's a sample. Outlook on the web. You can see, of course, it's integrated in the web applications of the Office services. It's, of course, in SharePoint. It's also in Microsoft Outlook, as you can see with the bar here in Bing. And it's coming to more and more applications. So with that, again, it's personal and it depends on the permissions the user has. So I only get results where I'm entitled to see the content here. So with that, let's have a look how this looks like. So I have also opened a browser here that's the wrong browser. Let's take this one. Overview of Microsoft Search, you can see this bar here. And if you're interested how to configure it, we will see that during the session here that we can configure it with various roles here. Basically, there are two roles, like a search admin and a search editor. So if you're looking at that from an administrative side, you can define these two roles here. I'm currently here administrator of my demo account, and you can see here, that's my account here, and I'm using search experience, let's say in SharePoint. So I go here to a site, let's use this site here, Project Vienna, for example. How is the search experience here? Of course, I can go to the documents here. So that's a team site with a SharePoint site behind. So if I go to General and I search for, you can see there are some documents like BMW and Lorem Ipsum and Vespa and so on. And I'm a big Vespa fan. You can see it here. I have my Vespa model here with me as well. So this is how a nice looking scooter looks like. So I search, for example, for Vespa. You will see I get the result with some documents and some graphics in that case, like how does a Vespa look like, what documents are in here. And of course, it's using also, it understands various languages. So the languages like here, I have a document that's in Italian, for example, Vespa Storia. We will see that here in the preview. And we have other documents here as well from Tony and from Adele, for example, and so on. So that, of course, searches only my current SharePoint site. If I want to search for all the documents stored in Vienna, and I do the same here, I'll search for Vespa and let's say and scooter, for example. Of course, I can use Boolean expressions here as well. You can see I get this show more results. So here, this is Microsoft Search here. That shows me, well, there are some documents I'm entitled to see here, and I'm currently searching within the Project Vienna. That's my SharePoint site, but I can also search on the organizational level. So I can click on organization here, and you can see I get some more results here because there's obviously are documents stored not only in Project Vienna, and I also get some information here. Where can I find more information about Vespa? So this is Microsoft Search. It tries to look at various data sources and tries to give me one unified result with the information I'm looking for. It also provides or allows me to provide feedback here, like was this answer useful, for example, to improve the search experience. And what you also can see here in this organizational search is that we have these so-called verticals, which means the tabs, where I'm looking for that information. Of course, now I'm in all. So which means I would find that information here, and I also find documents. If I go to files, I would only see the files here. If I would go to sites, there's no site here with the name Vespa and Scooter. There's also no people in here and so on. Maybe there are some news entries and so on. Of course, I can reduce my search here. And you can see there's also this managed search history here as well. So this is also personal, which means Microsoft Search stores my data, my search history, if I want that. So I can click on that here, and we will see that, oops, where is it? Where did it go? My managed search history. So here we go. It opens my account here. I can download it. So opens in a new tab. Well, it just shows me the same results here. I will show it a little bit later, but it also stores the search results here as we saw here. And we can customize these tabs here, these verticals as well, and we can extend it with our own data sources. So the first part, how does it work here? So we, as administrator, we can go to the admin center and go to the settings. And here in the settings, we see the search and intelligence menu here. And here we can configure Microsoft Search, how it shall react, what kind of data we want to use here. So we see the usage analytics, the first tab here, insights, how is search used? So for example, you see some helpful information like no result queries. There have been searches for Technica or at work office or rules, COVID-19 or whatever, which didn't return a good result here. And we have some abandoned queries, for example, like these ones here, where the user simply didn't wait for the results, it simply closed the browser. So in this feedback, we would see the feedback from the users, and we could also react on that feedback. If a user says this search result wasn't useful for me, maybe I need to configure or I need to refine it or need to take care that the search returns better results here. So these are the things that are here in the insights. And that second part here, the answers, is important for adding, for example, acronyms, bookmarks, and so on. So you can see there are some acronyms I already added in that demo tenant here, like, for example, PASS. What is PASS? So I can go here to my project here, or to my, let's go to this one here and say, what is PASS here? And I need to search for all, of course, and I see that acronym. There was one result here, and it says, well, PaaS stands for Platform as a Service. And this is exactly what I have defined in here. You can see this description here, and this is very useful, especially for large organizations, to add acronyms that make sense for the organization. Like, for example, what is my WET ID? That would be another thing. Like, I could go to Outlook here. So let's say search what is WET, for example. And I get a result here in Outlook. WET is an acronym, and it stands for Value Added Tax, and the WET ID of my organization is that one, for example. So this is also a very, very cool thing you can simply configure without the need of developmenters. So it's just configurable here in the Microsoft Admin Center. The next thing, you can also import and export data here from CSV lists as well. You can also define bookmarks. So you can see there are some predefined ones. So Microsoft already added some bookmarks, for example, Office install site. I added, for example, a homepage of our company here. So again, if I go to my SharePoint and say at work website, for example, you see I already searched for that. I should get the result here from that bookmark, and then I can click on that, and I'm taken to that website, for example. And you can see there's some more information, some more documents about this organization here. So that's also very useful. You can also go here and define floor plans. In that case, this means you would need to have floor plans in the AutoCAD DWG format, which is, I don't have any here, but it would make sense if you search, for example, for a room within a building or in a campus or something like this. Locations is also useful because this is using Bing Maps for visualizing that. So for example, you can see I've added 2 locations here, ADCD and at work, for example. Again, let's say at work office, for example, that's the name of our company. And I see the visualization that is defined here in the Search Admin dashboard. And you can add some Q&A as well. So for example, we currently live in a situation where we have to deal with COVID still. So I could say, okay, what are the current COVID rules? So let's say I'm searching for COVID-19 or COVID rules simply. And hopefully I get that information. Okay, this link here takes me way to more information about how the Corona rules are currently in my workplace or something like this. So this is very easy to use and very, very useful. With that very short thing, very short demo, let's go back to the presentation because I want to show you something more, the Microsoft Search demo, which we currently saw. You can use the Boolean expressions as here. Why should you use Microsoft Search? Well, the benefit here, it's one unified search endpoint, which means you can use Microsoft Search from the various services, and you can use it from your own applications as well. So the benefits of using it is, first of all, we don't have any setup. So it comes automatically with Microsoft 365. Secondly, it's very easy to use. We've seen some samples here, how we can access that data. It's personal. We have that history. We have things like spell correction in here. So if I'm looking for a word and I misspell it, SharePoint or Microsoft Search tries to correct me and says, did you mean this or that word? We can configure it a little bit, what we saw before. We don't need to take care of crawling or so. All that happens automatically in the background. And we can also, that's the second part, integrate our own data. With that, I want to show the differences between Microsoft Search and SharePoint Search, because we are used to use Microsoft Search in the SharePoint sites, and we have it fully integrated. So in the past, Microsoft calls the SharePoint Search Classic Search and Microsoft Search the Modern Search Experience. And you can see the second line here, what we saw, Microsoft Search is personal. In SharePoint Search, every user got the same result when searching for the same terms. Here in Microsoft Search, we have the graph behind, and the graph decides, okay, is this or how important could this information be for that user based on the signals I have collected? And that's also, from my perspective, a very cool thing, because it gives me more relevant documents if I collaborate with a colleague than if I'm not working together with a person on some documents, for example. The important part here, both technologies are using the same index, which means Microsoft Search is using SharePoint Search in the background. So if you turn off Microsoft Search in a SharePoint site, which is usually not recommended because we have permissions anyway, then Microsoft Search, of course, also wouldn't find any results here. Yes,
sorry,
please.
Tony, we've got a question in the chat from Lauren. How does the search handle multilingual? If I enter a question in English, will it show in the native language of the user, or do I have to enter the question in each language?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So if I search here again for Vespa, for example, you can see I find results here, and some of them, for example, are here. That's English. We have it in Italian, and we have it, for example, in German here. So there's no automatic translation or so. It simply searches for that term here. So for example, if I search for Vespa and scooter, because a Vespa is a scooter, I will find in that case only the English document, because both terms are included in that document. Here, obviously, it's also scooter is also part of that Vespa story of the Italian document here, but not in the German document, for example. So it searches really the terms you're looking for here in the search. There's no automatic translation or something, but what's coming in search is that it searches for the content, for the semantics. That's the word. So it also will be able to search for, if I search for scooter, it will find me all the documents that are relevant to scooter, so which have some kind of connection to that term here. I hope this answers the question.
I will let you know, Lauren, if you just want to tick it if you're happy with the answer. But yeah, thanks, Tony.
Sure. So search technologies, that's also one thing I really want to point out here. What kind of technologies do we have in the Microsoft universe? So we have the Microsoft Search that's built in. We don't need to take care of that. We have seen how it basically works. And there are some other, let's say, services we could use. So we have also SharePoint Syntax. So what's the difference between Microsoft Search and SharePoint Syntax and Viva Topics and Azure Cognitive Search? I also want to point it out here quickly, because SharePoint Syntax allows you to take data, let's say, from a form, process that form, detect the content with AI, and make that content searchable with, for example, Microsoft Search or any other technology here. The same goes for Viva Topics, where Microsoft AI tries to detect what kind of documents are, which topic is related to documents, for example, and tries to find out the relevant topics out of that. And Azure Cognitive Search is a thing for developers that's not configurable. You have to develop that, and let me show you that quickly, a little bit more in detail, what you can do with these other search technologies, just to have some kind of differentiation here. So form processing would be one field SharePoint Syntax really provides here. So you can see how would it work if you would, for example, create a model for understanding a contract or an invoice or something, upload that, train a model to say, okay, usually an invoice or a contract looks like this. So I have a date, I have a topic, I have various fields here, and then I apply that model to the documents, and I have a kind of a, let's say, label for that information so that I can search for that information. So that's a little bit a different direction SharePoint Syntax is heading to. Viva Topics is more or less suggesting topics to me and says, well, these are the topics, these are documents, and topics I have extracted out of these documents. Are these topics relevant to you? And I, as a user, that's usually the SharePoint side, can decide, okay, yeah, Azure Backup maybe is important to me, and Graph API, but no Power BI. So it more or less leads me to a better topics experience to say, if I search for Azure Backup, for example, then these documents will be found based on the automatic classification for that. And the last part that also differs from Microsoft Search is the Azure Cognitive Search, because this is what I mentioned before for developers. So you have to develop an app, and that app is simply using the Azure Cognitive Search and is using the indexing and the query engine of Azure Cognitive Search. With that, for example, you can upload your documents to a blob storage or to a SharePoint site nowadays and say, okay, that's a product catalog. And in that product catalog, I have images, let's say in Italian languages, in the images, and OCR detects that text here and says, oh, well, that's Italian, and then maybe classifies that into a topic or so, into an index, and says, now I can search for scooter. And in reality, it's set in the Italian term for scooter. So that would be one use case where Azure Cognitive Search can make sense. And the benefit here, it will be included in Microsoft Search as well. So if you have developers who are working with Azure Cognitive Search, you can also integrate that into into Microsoft Search here. With that, I want to show you how you can use can more or less use and configure Microsoft Search here with the so-called graph connectors. So Microsoft has these possibilities to add data to Microsoft Search. Of course, it searches SharePoint, Exchange, documents that are stored in there. But for example, you could also add a blob storage or something like this. So we have these three technologies here. So we have the built-in connectors Microsoft offers. We will see that in the configuration later. We have partner connectors. Let's say you have a Confluence intranet site and you want to make that content searchable as well. So there are more than 100 connectors from partners available. And of course, we have the Graph API, which we can use for our own purposes. So how does this look like? So one sample here would be a Microsoft connector. That would be the so-called Azure Data Lake Storage Generation 2 Graph connector, which sounds great, which is in reality nothing different than, let me show you that here in the dashboard, then a connector to an Azure storage. So if I go to data sources here, you can see I already have connected some external data sources. So that's very simple to use that. So I can go here to add and say, I want to add a new data source. So once this here is loaded, it will show me what kind of connectors are available here. You can see that's the Microsoft Search connectors. So maybe refresh that page here to see what connectors we can use. So I pressed F5 to reload it. So here we go. And here you can see we can connect, for example, to Jira, to Confluence, to Azure SQL Server. And that would be the connector if I want to search for data that is stored in an Azure storage table. Why would I want to use that? Well, for example, you say I have thousands of documents, which are maybe Office documents or PDF documents or so, and I don't want to add them to a SharePoint site because it costs me storage and I don't really need them. I just need them for archiving purposes, but I want to be able to search for documents which are, let's say, maybe 10 years old or so. So that would be a use case where such a storage connector could make sense. And if I go back to the presentation, I just want to quickly show you how you could configure that, because that's the same concept for all of these connectors. So you add the connector, what we saw here in the admin center, you select the connector type, then you give the connector a name here, like marketing, for example. And on the left, you can see the various steps of that, let's say, wizard you need to follow here. Then you need to connect to that data source. If it's a blob connector, you would simply go to that Azure connector, go to the access keys, take the connection string, or of course the connection string to the SQL database or Confluence or Jira or whatever it might be, and add that here to the connector configuration. We need to do one more thing with the blob storage, because how does Microsoft Search know that something happened in that storage? Well, it needs to have some kind of messenger. And the messenger in that case with a storage, for example, would be a so-called queue. So we would need to configure such a queue and say, well, if something happens in the storage, I need to tell Microsoft Search about it. Something has changed, please reindex. And this is exactly what needs to be done here. So I added a queue. That's just a name for a notification. And when the queue is created here, we can add these two information to the storage connection string. So we say, here's the access to the storage itself, to the blob storage, and here's the queue that informs me if something has changed. So we can test that connection, and after that connection was successful, Microsoft Search can talk with that connector. We can assign properties, and here it depends what kind of properties we have. So how is the data source configured? What kind of information do I have in in here, what's the schema behind it. So if it's a file system like a blob storage, I would say, well, relevant for me is the title and of course the URL and the last modification time. And I don't really have much more information. Maybe there's the information, who was it, but that's it. I don't have any more meta information here. So that's more or less the mapping where I can say, okay, this is information, and here you can see the switches in the manage schema section here. Which field do I want to make searchable? And here I can define, okay, this field should be searchable and that field should be searchable and should be able to be refined and so on. The next part is the important thing here about the permissions, because the Microsoft Search allows me to add permissions to specific items. So I can say, or to a specific connector. So I could say, well, everyone in my organization can use this connector and is able to search for data that is stored somewhere else. I could also restrict it and say, well, it's only for people with access to this data source, which means I would add the ID of a group in here and say, well, only members of this group are able to use that data. Again, it's based on the permission levels here as well. And this is how I can configure that in that kind of connector. Then I can say, okay, how often shall Microsoft Search refresh the information? For example, if it's an archive, I would maybe say only a day or once a week or something like this. And then I simply finish with that connection. And when that is done, the crawling automatically starts. You can see in that slide here, we have this marketing connector here on the bottom of the page here, and we can see start time and how many documents there have been indexed. So that's the basic idea here, how you can add such a connector. In my case, if I go back to my data sources, you can see I already have connected that here in the contracts, and you can see that one here is ready. And it was last updated 6 minutes ago, and currently it contains only 23 items. So I can use for these, I can search for that
Tony,
data here. Yes, please.
So just whilst you're on that, we've got a question from Valdemar. He uses hybrid search, and he thinks about 90% of the data he's able to find, but some pages and documents in the results don't seem to come through. So you can see that data was crawled on the on-prem server. But is there what kind of route would you take in terms of diagnosis in order to sort of filter things, but also to find out where things are failing in the crawl?
Yeah, that's a good part. So you're looking for data that's simply not findable, but you're sure that this that data is available in the data source itself. So basically, it could be a filter that's in the connector. So for example, if I go to a connector here, we see just, okay, there are that many items indexed here, and sometimes we get a statistics or not. So that's one thing that they will hopefully fix or so. But you can configure, I would personally try the following in such a case to troubleshoot it a little bit, to add a new connector here, ensure that there's no filter in place, because you can, for some connectors, you can add, for example, custom query language filters or filter them with other expressions as well. So that would be one thing. The second part could be to look at the logs. I think that's also part here in the admin center. I would need to follow up on that.
Yeah, and Valmar's just said he uses hybrid search, not the connector. So I'm assuming that's a hybrid SharePoint search.
Yeah. So it's also possible to use the data, but again, maybe one possibility would be simply to add a new connector to see if you don't have any filters there in place, if it then works, or look at the logs in that case for the hybrid connector. Okay. I think that could be maybe the solution, but you need to really dive into that topic here.
Thanks, Tony.
Sure. So just one thing when talking about the connectors here, some connectors have limitations here, like what we talked before, for example, like filters. So for example, that blob, that specific connector only works for Office documents and PDF documents, not for images, for example. And the file size needs to be less than 4 MB, which makes it not so much useful. But again, it really depends on the connector. Basic limitations of the Graph API connector or of the limits are listed here. I've added that link here as well, just to give you an idea. It's not unlimited. So for example, currently we have 700,000 items per connector available only. So if you have a product catalog that exceeds 1 million items, for example, you cannot use it currently with one connector, and you can only configure 10 connections per Microsoft 365 tenant. So I think that's also important to know that in the background, that there are some limitations here, also for the speed of inserting data or querying data. So I want to show you how you can use it from your own tools with your own data as well here. And the presentation itself and the scripts are available here on my GitHub directory. Just want to show you that quickly so you can download it here from here. And here you can find the presentation. I updated it 1 hour ago. And here you can find also the PowerShell commands, which I'm currently going through, just that you know you don't need to you can simply use it from here. So I want to show you how you can access that from your own, with your own data. So here I have Visual Studio Code, and you can see some PowerShell scripts here. And if you want to work with data from an external application, you need to have that information. You need to have an application to access the Microsoft Graph. And I want to show you quickly how you can do that, because that's important. That's the same concept for all of these connectors, more or less, if you want to do it from your side. So the first thing would be go to Azure Active Directory here, go to the app registrations and create a new application. And I already did that here. So you can go here, say, I create a new MS Search demo Teams Nation, for example, application, and I say that's only available in my tenant here. I register this application. The second part I would need, then I get the application and the directory tenant here. I would go to the API permissions and say I want to access data from the graph for external search. So I would need to go to the add permissions, take the Microsoft Graph resource provider here and say, in my case, I want to access that as an application here, what I'm currently doing. And I search for external, you would see there are 2 permission sets here. I would need to add the external connection read-write and the external item read-write to be able to ingest data into Microsoft Search here. So I would add excuse me, these permissions here. You can see an administrator needs to grant the admin consent for that. So when I've done that, I now have the permissions. And the last part here, I need to go to the certificates or secrets, depending how I authenticate. In my case, in my sample, I simply use the application ID and the secret. So I would go here and say, create a secret and say that is valid for 6 months or so. So then I have the data that would be my password, my secret here. So I've already done this here with a different application here. It's the same tenant. And here I authenticate against the graph. And just for demo purposes, I have it here in clear text here. I simply run this. So what I get here is now a token, and I write the token here to a file called token.txt. So this one is just created here. So that would be the token. So I copy the token just to show you what's in there, what you can do with that token. So let's go to my browser here and go to jot.ms, because here I can simply paste in that token, see what's in that. So I can see the token was, the issue of the token was the security token service of Windows.net. I want to access the graph here, and here can see the permissions which I currently have with that token. And that's the name of the application and the valid, how long it's valid. So it's valid for 1 hour, the token, and so on. Don't do this with productive tokens, please. It's just for demo purposes in my demo tenant here. Of course, I will change the secret afterwards. But this is just to show you how you can access that. So once you have a token, we can now say, please give me a list of the connectors here. So I simply do a GET request against that endpoint here, and I see, okay, currently I have these applications here, these connectors here. So I can, let me reduce that a little bit here on the side and go to my admin dashboard. And this is exactly what we see here. So I just need to find my browser window again and make it a little bit more readable here maybe. So here we go, and increase that. So this is exactly what we see here in the admin center, like trainings, cloud, contracts, parts, session 1, for example. So with that method, I can now access that and ingest my own data. I can create my own connector. So for example, I can say, I create a new connector that's called sessions 2. That's the endpoint, that's a post method, and simply run this here. So I have now added another connector from PowerShell in that case with the name of session 2 here. And if I run the get connectors again here, so let's do that and run it, I should see that there's now a new connector called sessions 2, which is currently in status draft. So usually it takes some minutes for the connector to be available. If I do the same thing here, I refresh that here, we should see that there's now this sessions 2 here. So now we have created a connector programmatically, and we can now start ingesting data. For doing that, we need to do one more thing here. We need to define how the data looks like. So we need to register a so-called schema to say, what information will I store in there? In my case, I called that connector sessions, which means these are trainings or sessions of Team Nations, for example. So I have an ID, of course, for that element. I have a title of the session. I have a date when it happens, and I have a speaker who is responsible for that session, a room and the audience, and maybe a type or so. So if I run this here now, it will not work because that's still currently in draft here. I can try it. I simply run that schema here with that connector here. Oh, in that case, obviously it didn't give me an error. So obviously it was fast enough to add that schema here to that connector. But let's see, check again here. If I refresh again, let's see. Yeah, this usually also, if I edit the schema, this takes some minutes. Here you can see there are currently no items in here. It was just created right now. So let me show you quickly how you can ingest your own data here. So for example, go here. In that case, I'm using an existing connector that's already ready to use. That's my session 1. I say I create a new item. Let's say the ID of that item is 101. I here define the ACL, who is able to see that data. So you could say the product catalog, I have 100 items that are only available for a specific group of salespeople, but the rest of the items are available for every salesperson. In that case, I add that data here, like room 1, using extended search, blah, blah, blah. And I do the same. I call that endpoint here with a put request and say, there's new data for that connector again. Here I ingest that data into sessions 1 here. So let me run that. You can see the output here in the PowerShell terminal here. So that data has been added for everyone. And this is what this information here says, this one item here. So if I go now back here to my browser and I refreshed it, that I just updated sessions 1 here. There are currently 3 items indexed. You have no influence when the crawling mechanism starts. Usually it checks, okay, something has changed. I need to re-index that search here. So you can click on that icon here to refresh it. I've just added another one. So let's see if this happens in the next minutes or so. So again, this you can see it says just now updated, but it can take some time depending on the number of items, of course. How can you present that data here? Well, we can go again to the customizations here and see how is this presented. And here are the so-called verticals, which is what we see in SharePoint. We see all file sites. You cannot switch off all of them, but some of them. So for example, you cannot switch off files here, but for example, you can see I switched off the vertical Power BI. So here we say we have also the sessions 1. So I could go here and say, well, I create a new vertical sessions 2, for example, and say, okay, how is data inserted into that vertical? So I can go to, you can see still the old the classic search SharePoint, and here are the connectors. You can see I cannot select one because that's already not ready. It's still in draft here, but I have connected that one to session 1, and then you would say the query and so on. I can show that with the sessions 1 maybe. That should be ready with the vertical, of course. Sorry, let's go to edit here and change that. And this is the same. You can see I connected that sessions 1 with the connectors of session 1. Here you can enter additional filter queries like custom query language, for example. You could also add other filters, let's say only if the type is cloud or something like this, and you review that. What happens then, and this also takes some minutes, if I go back now to my search experience here and I press Control F5 here, that these verticals also take some time to show up here. So you can see the sessions 1 is still not here. And of course, session 2, I did not end up finishing that. But this is how the user experience is with these verticals. There's one more thing you need to do here after the vertical is created, like, for example, for parts here. That's also an external data source where I can search for car, for example. You see, we get a result here, or if I search for training and I search for, let's say, Azure, let's find something, hopefully. I've already inserted some sessions from other events here, and we also need to define how the result is shown. So in that case, I added some icons here, and that's the second part we need to do here. That these are the so-called result types here. So I can go here and say, I add a new result type. How shall the result of that data source be presented? So I can go here to my result type, created sessions 2, for example, and go to the content source and say, well, the content source for that, now it's ready. I can select that sessions 2 with that one item in here. Then I can add some more rules. And in that case, that's important, the layout designer. How is it presented? And I can customize that with the so-called search layout designer here that says, well, there are some proposals. The result could look like here or here, for example. So I can say, oh, I want to use this type here. Then I click Get Started here, and then I end up in the Search Layout Designer here. And that Search Layout Designer is nothing else than a so-called adaptive card here. So I can click Edit Layout here, and you can see that I have now a layout payload editor. So let's add that here. And this is what I draw here. So I say, I want to have the title here. I want to have the modified by date. I want the type of the session here, and so on. I want the description here. And this is what's generated here. That's simply a JSON document with an adaptive card here. So you could also use the adaptive card designer, but let's say, okay, I want to have it like this here. Copy that, go back to my admin dashboard, paste that JSON in here, and say, this is how my result shall be layouted. And then I'm done. So this is the configuration experience we have in here. And this results in what we see here in the trainings. If I search for Azure, for example, or let's search for a colleague here, like search, for example, you can see in that case, it's all the same here. Maybe I have another sample with cloud or so, because for some sessions, I think I used a different layout. Yeah, you can see it here with the icon here on the right side. If the audience is cloud, I used the layout showing a cloud icon. And for the other sessions, I used this icon here. So this is how the search experience, how the search result looks when you configure it here with the so-called verticals and with the result types here. One thing I also want to mention here is the so-called configuration. You can say, do I want my Microsoft Search to be integrated into Bing as well? That's not so common in Europe, but you could use it if you say, I go to bing.com and I go to work here and I search for, in my case again, for Vespa, for example. You can see you have the history here as well, like Vespa Storia, for example. I get the Italian document here, and this work item here simply connects to my Microsoft 365 tenant and says, well, these are the verticals we have defined in here. We can search for that data and use the browser here for that search experience as well, to make it very easy, very consumable for the users to find the data just with Bing search. So you can configure if you want to use that or not here in the configurations. Okay, with that, there's one thing I just want to add here. If you want to access it programmatically as well, there's also a sample you can use, you can check out, which is this one here. There's a GitHub repository in the Microsoft Graph samples that shows you a sample how you can access these connectors, what I did with PowerShell with C# code. And if you run this sample here, you simply get a database. In that case, that's a SQLite database, and you can use that database to say, I want to ingest that data from a database. I'm not using the REST API, what I did in the PowerShell scripts, but I'm using the Graph SDK for accessing that data. I have opened that here, and the experience here is a little bit different. So if I open my Visual Studio here, it's the same concept. You need to install some prerequisites here. You need to say what is the tenant ID, the app ID, the secret. You need to create a database. And then when you run this application here, you can play around with that and see how this basically works. It's using the SDK for accessing that data here. And this is what the application does. It's a console application here. So it simply says, connect to a connector, check the database and see what has happened, what has changed here. In that case, I would say second, select an existing connection here. And then I will contact the graph saying, what kind of connections do we have in here? And it should show me that parts here in the background here. So that's the connection where we have the connector, where we have the database in there. And this I have a breakpoint here, so maybe I should continue, remove that here. Go back to my application once it shows. And it now says me, Tony. Yeah, thank you. I'm coming to an end. So in that case, I would say that would be the part connector. And then I can say push update items for the current connections. And then that connector here will be updated here, that parts connector. And that parts connector just shows that data to finish that here with the parts. So if I search for a car, for example, we should see that in that case, we also have the option to say how this result here will be presented here. In that case, I get all items with car, for example. So that's also one thing. And the last part here is I want to go to my Vienna page here and to my so because I have this site here. You could also use this so-called PNP search items, which is here. And there's a cool site, AKMS PNP search, which allows you to add already to use web parts. And you have an installation guidance here as well and an introduction how this search can be added to your tenant here. And I already did that here in that window here. So actually it was that window. So let's go back here to my SharePoint site here. And then you can add a page here and add your web parts, like let's search for Vespa, for example, and define how the verticals shall be looked, how the result shall be presented. So if I go to edit here, you will see that these are extra web parts. And the interesting part here for that web part, for example, would be to connect that with Microsoft Search. You can see there are a lot of things you can configure here. And the interesting part here is that you need to connect it to the search box that is here to say, okay, what I enter here is being presented here in the search vertical. So that's also a very nice option you have as an administrator to say, I want to be able to configure the search experience here in Microsoft SharePoint. So my summary here is, how can you configure search? How can you use it? We have seen that search is easy to consume. It comes automatically with Microsoft 365. I don't need any additional license or so. If I have a license for SharePoint or for Outlook or so, it automatically comes out of the box. It supports various languages. Not everything is included. Like, for example, does it search Teams chats currently? No. So let's see what will come to Microsoft Search as well. And we have the option to use these connectors for our own purposes. One thing I want to end here is the roadmap, because here are some nice features that are already existing or already coming to Microsoft Search, like what I said at the beginning, Azure Cognitive Search. will be included in, or will be available to include in Microsoft Search, and semantic search. If I search for table, maybe I also get chairs. So these are highlights from my perspective. And there's also a roadmap Microsoft provides, which is here. And this roadmap is shows you where on what topics the Microsoft team is currently working on. So that would be the URL for Microsoft Search, and you can simply follow that. For example, we see that in February they had the Confluence Cloud Graph Connector updated, or refiners are available. You can see this is a very, very cool site where you see what the team is currently working on. With that, here are some more links for to follow them if you're interested in discover more of Microsoft Search here. And the first link here includes my presentation and my PowerShell scripts if you want to follow that, if you want to try it out here. So there are a lot of cool resources. And with that, I'm almost at the end of my session. Many thanks for your interest. I hope it was useful, and I hope I could give you some insights of Microsoft Search, and that it's a very cool topic to dive in. With that, thank you, and have a nice rest of the event of Teams Nations. Thank you.